It's time for the final installment of the 2022 Louisville Football Positional Preview Series. This episode is dedicated to the secondary. Let's get right on into it.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. For those who are not aware of who I am, I serve as a credential media member for Cardinals Sports Zone. I also do some PA announcing work for the university in various sports. I want to take this time to personally thank you for making us your first listen of the day. And just a reminder, the Locked On Louisville podcast is free on all streaming services, 5 days a week, your team every day. In the final installment of the long 2022 Louisville Football Positional Preview Series, we are dedicating this episode to the secondary, where there are a lot of new faces between the cornerbacks and the safeties positions, respectively. We are going to dive into the initial depth chart that was released in the media guide for the cornerbacks first, and then we'll look into the secondary for the safeties, and then the final segment we will identify and analyze the cases, the breakout cases for two possible candidates. So starting out with the cornerbacks, and I think that this has to be made known or made at least, I feel like I should at least explain myself when I say that I mentioned in the last episode when we discussed the linebacker position that the initial depth chart, yes, it should be taken for face value in the fact that that's where the current roster is sitting. But I wouldn't put too much into it. I wouldn't treat it as set in stone, as I mentioned on the last episode, just because there's a whole fall camp where guys are going to be competing and stuff like that. So, things are going to change, but it does paint a solid picture of what things are looking like already. So, very, very excited to kind of, be able to dive into the secondary. Beginning with the cornerbacks, we're going to look at the initial depth chart. No surprise really needed here for the first cornerback position. Kei'Trel Clark is listed as the starter. Behind him is Rance Conner or Jarvis Brownlee Jr. Derrick Edwards, the fourth string behind those. The other cornerback position, Chandler Jones, the senior veteran, is listed as the other starter, opposite of Kei'Trel Clark. Trey Franklin, the redshirt sophomore, behind him. And then the third string listed now is junior transfer Quincy Riley. Overall, there are about, I think there's, was it 5 or 6 cornerbacks? I think it's 6. Yeah, 6 cornerbacks that are on scholarship for this team. Very, very just overall, excited to kind of see how this, actually 7 cornerbacks, I do apologize. I'm excited to see how this position battle kind of comes about, because number one, and this is the main thing, is Kei'Trel Clark's health is the main factor. When Ben Souders came on to the Cardinal Sports Zone podcast, he mentioned that Kei'Trel Clark's rehab was going great. He looked solid on the field in his workouts. Got hurt in that game against NC State last year down in Raleigh, the middle of the season. A torn ACL, I do believe. Missed the remainder of the season, obviously, and has been rehabbing to get back. I don't think he participated in spring practice, but obviously seems like he's going to be a full go at the beginning of the season. If not at the beginning, then very, very shortly into the season. This is pretty much set in stone, kind of like the linebacker positions that we discussed yesterday, that the starters make sense, right? Kei'Trel Clark, Chandler Jones, both listed as starters for seemingly the past 3 seasons and counting for this Louisville program, and it's great to have that veteran consistency, especially with how much roster turnover came at the end of last season, or really before the end of last season, with some transfers and things of that nature. So Scott Satterfield and Brian Brown and the rest of the coaching staff came into the offseason, identified the secondary as one of the spots that the team needed the most attention to in the transfer portal. Well, what happened? They went out and they really addressed it in in the portal. Now, obviously, Jalen Alexander, the Duke transfer, will not be a Louisville Cardinal. It doesn't seem like Jay Williams from USC will be a Cardinal either. So those are two guys that could have fit into the rotation. Likely probably would have fit into the rotation as safeties, with Williams maybe being more of a cornerback. But ultimately, Kei'Trel Clark being the starter here, I do think that in all reality, I think he could end up as a day 2 NFL draft prospect next April. I'm very, very high on Kei'Trel Clark. Obviously, last season was a guy that most quarterbacks just did not throw the ball his way because he's very, very, very athletic for his size. Not the biggest guy out there. I'm trying to pull up his exact height. Clark is listed as 5'10", but plays a lot bigger, 30 tackles last season, 3 interceptions. That's I think top 40 in the country. Had 9 pass deflections, which was top 50. Honestly, I think those numbers probably maybe rise a little bit if other quarterbacks just simply threw the ball his way. But usually with the top cornerbacks, not a lot of quarterbacks like to test those guys throughout the air. So Kei'Trel Clark, a true number 1 cornerback in the ACC, and in my opinion, honestly, one of the top 5 best in the conference. Chandler Jones on the other side of him. Chandler Jones last year, it was an interesting situation because Brian Brown and company kind of played him at safety at times. And Jones is a player that knows this defense, a veteran-led, a vocal leader on the defense. The coaching staff loves him, loves having him back there because he's like a quarterback of the defense. I think having that veteran leadership is very, very valuable to have. And I'm so glad that the Cardinals are able to, have him back into the mix. 40 tackles last season. Did not have an interception, I believe. I could be wrong. No, he did not, but he had 7 pass deflections. So obviously the starters are there, but I think the most interesting thing is the fact that, last year you had to have, true freshmen come in right away and play big roles, or even like a redshirt freshman. Greedy Vance was a guy that played some big time snaps last season. Kenai Walker, both of those guys transferred to Florida State and Oklahoma respectively. And then you had some other guys that entered the portal as well. So Scott Satterfield and company had to go out and he had to address the depth. Well, he went out and did just that. And I'm very, very excited for the overall additions to the program. We'll talk first about the returning guys. Trey Franklin listed as a backup to Chandler Jones. I think Chandler Jones obviously is going to be that starter going into game number 1. But Trey Franklin was probably the biggest surprise on the defense for me last year outside of Ashton Gelati. When Chandler Jones was being played more as a safety, Kei'Trel Clark went down with injury. It was Trey Franklin, the former JUCO transfer, that came into the secondary and really, made some big-time plays. Had some pass deflections, had, I think, a forced fumble and interception here and there in a couple of key ACC games and really helped the Cardinals throughout the mix. I think he made some big-time plays in that win against Boston College back in October, but I could be mistaken. But having Trey Franklin there is huge. Rance Conner is a guy that has been getting a lot of praise for his work in the offseason. The guy who was in the Flyville 21 class. I'm interested to see kind of what his role looks like with him being the backup to Kei'Trel Clark. Derrick Edwards III, also from the Flyville 21 class, kind of a cornerback safety hybrid, but listed as a cornerback. Now, I like, his size with that, 6'1", 6'2" size that Derrick Edwards has. Just overall very excited to see what he's able to do. The 2 additions via the transfer portal, Jarvis Brownlee Jr. from Florida State and Quincy Riley from Middle Tennessee State. I'm interested to see where they fit into the mix. Jarvis Brownlee Jr., I think, is a nice addition for depth purposes. I think that, had some instances to where didn't necessarily have some great moments at Florida State, especially I think it was in the game against Jacksonville State where I think it was a blown coverage or something like that. But, he was pretty solid throughout. So I think that Jarvis Brownlee Jr. at the very least is going to be a solid depth piece. And I think Quincy Riley could be the next Kei'Trel Clark for the Louisville Cardinals. I'm going to talk more about that in the third segment, a little bit of foreshadowing. But needless to say, I think Quincy Riley checks off all the boxes of what you're looking for in a number 1 cornerback. A little bit taller than Kei'Trel Clark, 6 foot, had 24 tackles last year, a ball hawk. in every term, in every sense of the term, was top 5 in the country in interceptions, had 5 of them, had 9 pass deflections, but overall able to play sideline to sideline, contend with bigger receivers, able to high point the football really well, and just be able to get there verticality-wise and athletically speaking. I think that he's able to contend with even smaller, quicker receivers, but doesn't really have a glaring weakness. I think that, getting into the weight room with Ben Souders and being able to transform his body just a little bit more, I think that the sky's the limit for Quincy Riley, but we will talk about him here a little bit in the third segment. But, hey, the name of the game is more veteran leadership for the secondary, but the cupboard has been replenished in terms of depth, in terms of the transfer portal, but obviously it's going to be on some guys to step up into the mix, some familiar faces, some unfamiliar faces, but ultimately a lot of guys in that room contending for a small amount of spots. So speaking of a lot of competition, the safety competition is one of those that I'm really, really looking forward to in fall camp. We're going to talk about that here in just a second after we talk about our friends and the title sponsor of the show, BetOnline. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your betting needs. Find all of your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. Find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and even golf. It continues to be the top online resource for all of your sports wagering information, from live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts. They have you covered across the board. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening today. BetOnline, where the game starts. Which NFL stars move the betting lines the most? Starting this past week, Locked On has been giving you the 50 most valuable players in the NFL from the odds makers over at BetOnline. Available this past week on Locked On NFL, wherever you get your podcasts, and on YouTube. So moving right on along into the final position breakdown, that is the safeties position. Some familiar faces, but also some new faces, kind of like the cornerback position. Coming into the offseason, Scott Satterfield and company realized that they had to address the cornerbacks position, but also realized safety needed some work as well. They got a couple of transfers into the mix. Let's look at the depth chart. The big news coming out of the safety position is that Kendrick Duncan Jr., the former Georgia Southern transfer, has announced he's coming back for his final season of college football. That came as a big surprise. He is the starter at free safety. The strong safety starter is listed as Josh Minkins Jr., the Louisville native. Behind him is Temple transfer MJ Griffin, and behind Griffin is 2 true freshmen, D'Angelo Hutchinson and Jeremiah Caldwell. Behind Duncan, Nicario Harper, the FCS standout, and behind him is former JUCO prospect Shavarick Williams, sophomore. So overall, I think that there are a couple more guys that could end up getting into the mix over at safety. You were looking at players like Antonio Watts is another true freshman that kind of fits into that mix. So overall, I'm really excited just to kind of see how the competition goes, because Kendrick Duncan Jr., getting him back is literally, getting a possible, all ACC type caliber guy. Third on the team in tackles, 76 overall, had 1 sack last year, 4 pass deflections, 1 interception. And it's big, especially because replacing one safety is huge, but having to replace 2 of them is really a tall task, and they're having to replace Quinterio Cole. But I think that they're doing that with 2 players, Josh Minkins and MJ Griffin. Josh Minkins, a guy that a lot of coaches raved about in the offseason last year, battled some injuries, though, and it kind of hindered his season last year, but he was able to see the field more and more as the season went on, as he got healthy, and was able to make some big-time plays. Made a big play in that game against Clemson down in the red zone. I think it was the 3rd or 4th quarter, if I'm remembering correctly. But I'm extremely excited to see what Minkins is able to do. And also MJ Griffin. Griffin's a guy that is kind of like Quinterio Cole in the fact that he's a hard-hitting sideline-to-sideline type safety. Kind of like a James Sample is kind of who he reminds me of. I think that he is going to be due for a possible breakout year. Had 66 tackles last year. I think was like he either led Temple or was second on the team for the Owls in tackles. Had a sack last season. 22 tackles back in 2020. He's listed as a sophomore, but he's been in college for 3 years. So only, I think, had one tackle in 2019, and then the COVID year granting the extra year of eligibility. So MJ Griffin, Josh Minkins, I think that I'm not sure if either one of them are going to replace Quinterio Cole outright. I think we're going to see those guys both play a good amount of snaps, and that's a big thing to have, in my opinion, is having both of those guys really compete. And I think that might be one of the biggest competitions heading into fall camp that I'm looking forward to. Is you have Josh Minkins and you also have MJ Griffin, two bigger defensive backs. Griffin at 6'1", Minkins I think is more like 6'1", or I'm sorry, 6'2", or something around those lines. But also, both guys are very, very talented. Behind them, D'Angelo Hutchinson, Jeremiah Caldwell, a 4-star recruit according to Rivals. He's a guy that was kind of a late addition to the Flyville 22 class. I think I could have seen him play either cornerback or safety, but I think his ability to kind of read the quarterback's eyes and be very, very solid in terms of tackling really kind of fit maybe the safety mold a little better. Hutchinson, on the other hand, is another guy that I think the film kind of speaks a little bit more towards him being a little bit more underrated in the class. But I think it'll just depend. Obviously, it's hard to predict who's going to redshirt, just considering the fact that it's still so early. Injuries do happen, so you can't really make that assessment yet. But if we see Chandler Jones start to play a little bit of safety again, maybe you see one of those guys possibly redshirting. Antonio Watts is another possible redshirt candidate. 3 true freshmen that I'm not saying that they're not talented or anything of that nature. I'm just saying that the opportunity right now might be a little scarce, especially when you're competing for 2 spots. And one of those spots is going to a guy who is going to be one of the leaders in the defense, and Kendrick Duncan Jr. Like I mentioned, Kendrick Duncan Jr. coming back, basically, opens up a realm of possibilities for this defense, because I'm so excited to see what he can bring to the table. He's a ceiling raiser for this Louisville defense. I truly do believe that at the end of the day, when you kind of mention what this defense needs, is it needs veteran leadership, it needs continuity and things of that nature, and just overall very, very excited to see what he's able to do this season with another year inside of Brian Brown's defense. I'm interested to see what Wesley McGriff's role is in coaching up this secondary and things of that nature. Another guy that transferred in that I think is going to be playing a solid role is Nicario Harper, the transfer from the FCS ranks. This is a situation to where I think that we're going to be kind of seeing this in a light of kind of like a Tyler Hudson, an FCS guy that comes over, but you kind of get caught up in the FCS label and don't really see how talented of a guy he is until he's on the field. And you're like, wow, this guy was in the FCS. I think Nicario Harper is going to be a guy that's going to be really, really solid in the 2 deep and just overall giving very, very solid depth. One of the issues with the Cardinals secondary throughout the past couple of seasons since Scott Satterfield took over has been the depth in the back end of the defense, especially at the safety position. And I'm glad that the Cardinals were able to add to the safety depth, but not only add to it, but also add a veteran guy who's played multiple snaps of college football. So safety position's an interesting one. Kendrick Duncan Jr., his starting spot is seemingly safe. But there's going to be some big time competition at the strong safety spot. So we're going to have to take look at that after fall camp. Kind of switching gears, talking about the 2 breakout candidates. Well, MJ Griffin and Quincy Riley are my 2 picks for the breakout candidates. I'm going to explain to you why here in the final segment of the show. Obviously, if you're watching this on YouTube, you're not going to hear the implemented advertisements that I have I have implemented into the episode. But if you are listening to this, obviously you're going to check those out. So stay tuned. Hey, Cardinal fans, once again, I do want to say thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the Locked On Louisville podcast is free on all streaming services 5 days a week, your team every day. The two breakout candidates for the Louisville secondary, in my opinion, are MJ Griffin and Quincy Riley, two transfers into the program. Obviously, neither listed as starters, so you have to take things into context. Maybe the opportunities will be there, later on in the season. I think that these are going to be guys that play immediately right away. Maybe not starting snaps, but some high quality, rotation snaps. I think they're going to have solid fall camps to where, at the very least, they're going to be the backups to a certain position. MJ Griffin at the safety position, hard-hitting safety, like I said, really reminiscent of James Sample, a solid replace for Quinterio Cole. I was a little not necessarily shocked, but kind of intrigued to see Josh Minkins listed as the starter at strong safety. I'm interested to see how much MJ Griffin is going to contend for that starting spot. I'm assuming it's going to be a lot. So iron sharpens iron, regardless of who the starter is. I think that both Griffin and Minkins are going to both have a lot of snaps between the two of them. Griffin, just kind of a sideline to sideline safety that's going to be involved in the run game. Solid in the passing game as well. I think that it kind of gets overlooked because he's such a good run defender, just gets involved in the plays, that he's a solid pass defender as well, and does a great job of reading the opposing quarterback and being able to cover slot receivers and tight ends kind of coming over the middle, a little bit bigger for a defensive back, 6'1", over 200 pounds. So I could definitely see him placed on opposing tight ends when the card position or the dog position's not guarding the tight end or the slot receiver. So MJ Griffin is one of my selections for a breakout candidate. I think he's going to have a solid season. Quincy Riley, honestly, might be my biggest breakout candidate for the defense as a whole. Listed as a third string, but do not let that fool you, Cardinal fans, because Quincy Riley is possibly going to be the next Kei'Trel Clark. Kei'Trel Clark came from a non-Power 5 school over at Liberty and definitely showed out for the Flames. Quincy Riley kind of in the same situation where he's transferring out of a non-Power 5 program, showed out for the Middle Tennessee Blue Raiders last season, 24 tackles, had 5 interceptions. 5 interceptions is tied for 4th in the country, and had 9 pass deflections. I think, like I said, has all the qualities that you're looking for in a true number one cornerback. Might not necessarily be the tallest guy, but has a lot of verticality, can high point the football, does a great job of contending with smaller, quicker receivers, but also can go stride for stride with the big receivers and contend in 50-50 jump balls. So does a great job of reading opposing quarterbacks. I like the footwork there. I like the explosiveness and the pursuit, and really is just a solid player overall. I think he's one of those guys, kind of like Kei'Trel Clark. There's not one thing that stands out about his game, but he's just an overall solid and fundamentally sound player. I know that he's listed as a third string, but I'm telling you, if there's one player that I'm telling you to pay attention to right now, it is Quincy Riley. In my opinion, one of the more underrated transfers in the country, regardless of where they ended up. So MJ Griffin, Quincy Riley, the two guys that I have as the possible breakout candidates. But the whole secondary is based, it's got a lot of veteran leadership, some familiar, some unfamiliar, guys that have played a lot of snaps at the collegiate football level, some younger guys that are looking to prove their that they belong and that they can turn in a lot of production. So I'm excited to kind of see some of the younger guys that have redshirted in the past. We'll see if the true freshmen are able to come in and have an impact. But obviously, a lot of competition at both of the secondary positions that we're going to have to keep an eye out on as fall camp kind of comes about. So basically, That wraps up the long installment of Position Preview series. You could check them all out on YouTube or wherever streaming service that you use. Be sure to check out the Locked On ACC podcast hosted by Candace Cooper to get all of your ACC news ahead of the football season. We're a little over a month away. Just a reminder, we are back in season for the podcast starting in August. So if you have any suggestions of content, of guests, be sure to reach out. I'm really, really excited to get another season of the Locked On Louisville podcast. We're quickly approaching the 1-year anniversary launch of the show. I appreciate everyone that's listening, subscribing, rating, sharing the podcast on whatever streaming or social media platform service that you're using. But that's going to wrap up this special Sunday edition of the show. Everyone have a great day. We will see you right back here very, very soon.